They had overdrafted pulling funds from their account in Brazil, sending funds to Colombia. And in that circumstance, that was an overdraft of the order of magnitude of like hundreds of millions of dollars. And yeah, exactly. And like that's something I've seen in my personal bank account.
No.
Like that's something I promise in the near future.
Wait. So did they get like a $15 fee? Like how did that?
This is a foundational transformation we see happening in the economy.
DeFi and blockchain are redefining business, the economy, and our society.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the ReDefined podcast. I'm Jeremy Almond, your co-host, alongside my awesome friend, Megan Guy. What's up, Megan?
Hey, doing well, thanks. I'm quite excited for today's conversation. We have a guest joining us actually all the way from São Paulo. Ezra Kabrab, great to have you on the pod.
Thanks, Megan. Great to be here with you and Jeremy. Appreciate you guys for having me. I'm honestly honored. I love that we're in the modern era where we can get three folks from all over the globe all together here on the same call. Maybe a little background. Family's Ethiopian and Eritrean, born and raised in DC myself. Grew up in the Americas. Found myself working payments the last decade. Started with a peer-to-peer wallet that we built about a decade ago, which we sold off to Square. Eventually moved on to then Intuit and then Visa, where I last was like leading our real-time payments initiatives and then our open banking acquisition projects before running a fintech accelerator program. Now working with Caliza. So Caliza really focused on the idea of like democratizing financial services in the form of offering dollar accounts to companies to offer their users, as well as instant cross-border settlement. It's a mouthful, but really it's the ability to send money between one bank and another bank in different countries, between Brazil, Mexico, and the U.S. today.
Ezra, you're like, you mentioned we're all in different places. You're in Brazil. So how did you end up kind of in Brazil and that as the launch area for Caliza?
In the last decade, I would say, we've seen a lot happen right within domestic payment systems globally, in the sense that as recent as 7 years ago, we had only like 10 countries that had real-time payments. Today, there are well over 80 that built this out. And Brazil is an interesting case study in a country where it is approached near ubiquity, where you've got folks across all socioeconomic classes, backgrounds, merchants, consumers, corporations. Everyone is really that wants to be embedded in any shape or form in the financial ecosystem has access to something called PIX, meaning you can send and receive payments instantly here. And so this has taken off all over the globe, but Brazil in a different level where I was so fascinated by this when I was at Visa. When I started on, ask myself, why doesn't this also exist to stitch this together to other systems where I can initiate a PIX from Brazil and then receive a recipient could receive the funds in, say, India, right, via UPI, or Mexico via SPAY, and so on. I was making frequent trips to São Paulo and ended up making the full-on move, collecting records. For that.
It's all a giant scheme to add more records to the back of your.
Pretty much. That was pretty much my like long flight decision. I'd say so. Like procure more records. I'd say the music collected in Brazil is up very low. I got to tell you.
We talked to a lot of people on the pod that are kind of blockchain native and true believers, as Jeremy calls them. We don't talk to as many folks, I think, who've come from traditional finance and moved across to blockchain and crypto. So I'd love to actually just unpack a little bit more, like what got you really excited about getting into this space coming out of, some of the biggest and most successful, I think, kind of traditional finance institutions with Intuit and Visa.
I came in as like an initial skeptic and then believer, but it took some time, I'd say. And like part of that is, I think like I've seen like a few different viewpoints where you've seen the far more conservative, skeptical view of the traditional financial services like banks and card networks and among other companies, and then you have kind of the crypto native on-chain specific I'd say perspective, which is rightfully like considering how do we circumvent like older infrastructure rails. And then I think there's like an interesting like middle ground of, well, like, and I personally think that banks will always exist. And I think it ties to this like idea that so long as governments exist, which we now hold a social contract with, banks will always be there to have to provide stored value, right, in a safe and convenient fashion. But I think the rails in which that payments are facilitated or moved between banks or financial institutions will always change, right? Just like in the last few decades, progress has not been tremendous in places like the US, but it has changed, right? Slightly from the 70s, where we saw Swift wires come out of a conference in Belgium, to still use checks in the US, which is interesting to say.
I know you love checks. You've got a good story about checks that we should.
I'm more than happy to bring up that story. But it's really just like the nexus of how do you help usher this like new era of like on-chain payments to those who are not crypto native. And so I think it's important to stitch together all the domestic payment rails that are coming about that are fiat, right, from central banks, and tie that together through stablecoins.
Did you ever think about doing it within a Visa or like a bigger financial institution, or was this always something that in your mind needed to exist as an independent company?
I think that's just often how a lot of these changes happen, right, in these spaces, is that it's only natural that like incumbents will build out like what has worked, right, historically. But if you're looking for any form of change, significant change at that, it has to always come from the outside, or it start to get adopted across the ecosystem. So there's that. There's also just like the fact that I've always been keen on starting something up. Probably started from my dad always telling me stories about you work at a bakery to learn how to make croissants, so you can start your own bakery, perfect the croissant, right? Some point or another.
What's the point of if it's centralized Web3 technology and it's effectively on a stablecoin that's on a fiat currency, like why is that any different than just another fintech company? Like what's the point of putting it on chain at all if it's not decentralized, if it's not sort of different?
I think every country is always going to want to control its own domestic payment schemes, right? I think that'll never change. But the issue is that finding common ground across them is extremely challenging. It's very difficult for a lot of these nations to find alignment, whereas it's like one nation or a handful of nations that get to dictate the standards or rules. You got organizations like BIS, right, that do this for like banking standards globally, but nothing for like payment systems, right? There have been an attempt to say, it was like Next, right, which says this is how we'll cobble together UPI, Pix, and SPAY. But I think crypto offers a handful of benefits beyond being decentralized. I think one is just like the idea of like smart contracts and being able to change things from batch processing to instantaneous processing or near like real-time processing cross-border, and creating a standard around that is where I get really excited. Meaning, when I say batch processing, the system that's used in the US today being called ACH. The challenge with ACH is that typically banks are taught are instructed to clear a transaction, or settle, I should say, on a daily, like once a day basis, right? Or even twice a day basis, I should say. Versus having the transaction settled the moment a user actually initiates it. So if Megan's sending funds to Jeremy, like under like a new regime, it would be such that with real-time payments, that settles immediately. Versus we're going to wait to send the funds to Jeremy at the next batch time. And so that system doesn't exist internationally. I think that's where there's like a void. That's where I get like pretty excited about like the opportunity that I think needs to be solved.
So it kind of sits somewhere between like a traditional fintech company who might solve that by setting up corresponding banks, right? As kind of maybe a way that a traditional fintech company would do it. And then, those of us on the crazier side would kind of go no, I don't think that actually the governments need to run the payment rails themselves, and that doesn't need to be centralized or federalized. So you're kind of sitting in the middle going, hey, this is a standard protocol as a way to be able to, settle between regions.
Exactly. And I think that's a good point of clarification. Like a lot of times when a standard fintech says we're going to do an instantaneous transfer versus an instantaneous settlement, what they're doing is, like you said, they're keeping funds in various bank accounts across the world. And they're saying, all right, in this case, Jeremy's sending money to Megan from the U.S. to Mexico, and in that circumstance, we already have money sitting in this bank in Mexico. We're going to go ahead and credit Megan's account, and then they're going to actually settle between their U.S. account, which they receive funds from Jeremy, and Megan's account via Swift wire at the end of the day. So they still have that liquidity risk or exposure themselves.
Yeah.
And that's what most fintechs do. To your point on the crypto side, many will say, well, we're going to send money from one wallet to, and I'm oversimplifying this, but like from one wallet to another wallet. And our idea is that everyone should have a wallet, but perhaps that should be abstracted from them, and that they can remove the funds right to their local fiat account.
And so the net effect would be then, faster settlement time for the user. Like what's the end user value that kind of comes out of not using, corresponding banks that then, sort of have a liquidity risk and things like that?
Faster settlement, transparency, lack of I'd say any hiccups. One of the biggest challenges of correspondent banking is that you might have funds tied up at a intermediary bank. This happened to a friend where over, I think it was a quarter of his net worth was stuck in a correspondent bank. And it was a clear which bank this was, right? Where funds would move from, I would just say XYZ Bank in New York to A Bank in France to, a GF Bank in Ivory Coast, right? For that matter. So you can imagine how disheartening that is, to say the least, among a number of other words that come to mind. Funds are tied up, and all the banks are pointing fingers at each other, partially because they don't know what happened, what went wrong, and it's like someone fat-fingered button, and the lack of consistency, right, on the messaging that's sent in the Swift wires. Because at the end of the day, payments is really a game of messaging and creating messaging standards that are understood and abide by the local regulations in every market, from a regulatory standpoint, anti-money laundering standpoint, and just general KYC standpoint. So meeting those standards, I think, is the most difficult part of making the payment mechanism work globally.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that with a number of deals we've done where we've invested with international funds. And well, it's pretty easy to set up a close when everyone is domestic and has their dollars and, a variety of US banks. When you're trying to do something internationally, it creates so much risk in the process for exactly those reasons you're saying. It's it should be straightforward. It feels straightforward. The person on one end says, look, I sent the wire and I have, the number, and yet the funds aren't there. And as you said, the banks, are all pointing fingers at each other, because sometimes there are multiple layers in that chain too. It's not even one correspondent bank with another.
To be perfectly honest, there's always a trade-off in any shift form, even with real-time payments. One of the biggest questions is fraud risk and management that folks ask about, because the moment you start to offer real-time payments in any shape or form, whether it's on fiat or crypto, you start to have this question, well, how do we mediate fraudulent transactions? And one big challenge or risk here in Brazil is, since the advent of Pix, which is absolutely stellar system, right? It works seamlessly. However, right, there can be challenges where you should be very cautious about walking down the street with your phone open. Look at your phone in certain places, São Paulo and Rio for that matter. And the reason for that is if your phone's unlocked and you do not have two-factor authentication on your bank apps, right, it's very easy for someone who's swiping your phone to then deplete your bank account. So there are caveats, right, to think about, and I think appropriate safety measures that have to be considered when you're offering real-time payments. But at the same time, I think it also unlocks so much more value. So folks are no longer tied up going into a Friday on accessing their own funds over the weekend for anything critical, whether it's bills, grocery shopping, you name it.
You look at it the local currency with the local payment, settlement that's real time, oftentimes in Brazil or in India or someplace like that. That infrastructure works. And then in your case, the view is use stablecoins as the way to be able to move between those sort of local on ramps and off ramps. And so stablecoins is kind of the blockchain connective tissue. Is that kind of how your mental model of all of this gets stitched together?
I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think it kind of goes back to this realization I had that, when you look at the breakdown of trade, 44% of trade today is in dollars, 38% in euros. That encompasses with 3/4 of just global transfers. And so, lo and behold, like the most popular stable coins out there, usually when you hear that word, you think of dollars, right? And I think only more recently you're hearing folks talk about euros and other local currencies. Central banks still have their own CBDCs, central bank digital currencies as well. And I look at dollar kind of being the, and that being another topic altogether as well. But I look at dollars.
Sorry, I didn't mean to shiver. Aaron can cut that out in the edit if we need to.
No, it's warranted. I mean, that might be a real topic. But I'm happy to give my candid thoughts on that as well. I will say that with stable coins, where I get excited is that dollars are still kind of the predominant form of cross-border trade, of trusted value. It's used for all sorts of commodities. It's what most people want to save and to trust more as being less volatile. That ironically, right, like gold is a great thing to save it, but if you think about something you want to save and then spend it, you probably don't want to spend something that you're saving in the long term, like gold for that matter.
So in that, we've had some other guests that, talked about the importance of having, a inflation resistant or ability to save, whether that's in Bitcoin or it's in stable coins. So in this case, like in Brazil, for example, where you're currently at, you look at it like, somebody would go into the Brazilian currency in stablecoin and then move over to the US dollar in stablecoin, or only for cross-border? Like, how do you actually see the behavior of a Brazilian, using a stablecoin? Are they keeping it in local currency and then they're just using it for cross-border transactions? Or are they using it, moving over to dollars for, savings? Like, how do you see that work?
It's a mix. The Brazilian, the BRL, Brazil real to dollar conversion is an interesting topic over the last few decades, but specifically in just the last decade and a half. You saw conversion rates vary from anywhere from 1 to almost 2 or so, 15 or so years ago, to now 1 to 5.6, depending on what this area is, 5.4 to 5.6 or so. And I think as a result of that, people are cognizant that they want to save in dollars for the ability to save against local currency fluctuations. Is one topic, right? But there's actually more friction in the cross-border payments because there are very stringent policies around FX here, where the moment you want to send funds abroad, you have to do an FX conversion. You have to withhold what's like the cross-border tax, and they have various sorts, one for asset or investment, one for payments, one for purchases. A lot of people want to find the most cost-effective way to make those payments, but they're also very wary of making sure they're doing things the right way, right? So that they're not flagged for doing things inappropriately. And that's part of why we've really tried to find a wedge there of how do we keep folks compliant with local policies while still providing the lowest cost, fastest way to cross-border payments. So give you an example to get a little more specific. You can go out and go to a crypto exchange today and acquire a stablecoin. You're technically, in most cases, not supposed to send that abroad. But if you want to use it for international purposes, that's where you have to go through a few steps, which we automate, of the conversion, the tax withholding, the central bank registration, and then you can send the funds right for some form of supplier payment or whatever it might be. Sorry, to go back to your original question, it is a mix of payment friction. I think that's the biggest use case, but there's also savings. Where I would say you go to a market like Argentina, savings is the predominant use case, and that payment follows, given that it's more hyperinflation.
And Ezra, how has the government responded to you guys and what you're trying to do? It sounds like it's been a pretty supportive policy environment in Brazil. What do you think has kind of created that dynamic?
Brazilian central bank is one of the most innovative ones I've seen to date, in that they really keep the industry on their toes, in the sense that they've said that they would not ban any cryptocurrencies. I would say no intentions to do so, but they're launching their own CBDC, and I think several central banks have attempted to do so, and They're launching with they're labeling direct, so I think it might be rebranded. And I remember when like someone may have asked them or inquired, like, what is going to be your stance on other Brazil real stablecoins? Which, like, for now, we do direct fiat Brazil real to USDC and other tokens. This, I think, represents their stance on just the industry as a whole. They said, you know what, we are launching our own CBDC. We're not going to necessarily ban other Brazil real stablecoins or anything else along those lines, but we do think we're building a pretty solid product that other banks and companies will be incentivized to use. Historically, that their track record is pretty correct, I would say, right? Like when you look at Pix and other systems that come about, Pix haven't competed with like certain other incumbents that have tried to launch competing services. The Brazilian central bank has done a remarkable job. I think that varies when you go to other countries, right? Where efforts behind cryptocurrencies are often stifled. Brazil is very, I'd say, pro-innovation in like payments, crypto, lending, things of that nature.
So they seem very technology forward, but there's probably like a continuum, right, of points of view on CBDCs, stable coins, right, like, and the issuers that are semi-independent, and then something that's like, decentralized, like a kind of a FAR version, which is the Bitcoin version. Like, how do you look at like a CBDC? Is that the path forward in your model, or is it, would you think that the competing versions of stable coins is kind of the way to go? Like, just how do you take the CBDC, since you're kind of on the inside and get to have some of those conversations, as good, bad, ugly, or somewhere in between?
I think we have to be like agnostic to the extent that, and maybe this is the cop-out answer, but I think we have to be open to whoever's winning, right? At this time, like, I think there's certain stable coins that are like have the proliferation and reach and success of like adoption where it makes sense for us with stable coins. I don't think CBDCs have quite gotten like I'd say widely in circulation or use in many countries, except where it like starts to make sense. I think it's still in the early days. I've heard various stances or positions on their like likelihood of success. I think also every central bank has different goals. Like in Brazil, they've made it clear that they don't have any international usage for it yet. Their main intention is how do we start to tokenize more assets and use this for more local, like a domestic financial instruments. I do think every country is different. I'm like very cautious how I talk about that Brazil, because like the Brazilian central bank, to put it like bluntly, is on top of it.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I've spent a fair bit of time with the regulators here in the U.S. and I think there is a fierce debate, which I think, from my perspective, is a good thing, that it looks like we're going to legislate our way away from allowing CBDCs in the U.S. We'll see, but that seems to be the way the wind is blowing. I think many of us are highly, highly skeptical of a centralized government tracking every single piece of every single transaction, for surveillance reasons, for potentially, many, many good civilians who are doing nothing wrong. And is that, legal in our civil rights? Maybe to take the other side, I think a bunch of us like really believe that legislating it away is a good thing. And so we'll see what the differences are in different landscapes. But I think, El Salvador's taken a really strong stance. Argentina's taken a really strong stance. The U.S. is seemingly they're going to take a strong stance. And, we'll see. And hopefully the market kind of competes its way. In Brazil, who are kind of the leading stablecoin providers that would be competing with the CBDC?
That is a good question. I don't know if I have like an immediate answer on like who is winning per se, but some of the ones you see pop up are BRLA, BRLZ, are maybe the first two names that come to mind. I'm sure there are a few others, right, in circulation that have kind of pitched us on the idea of like supporting them. It's still a bit early days for us to like kind of consider that. I think it's really the stablecoin or the direct fiat stablecoin route. Giving the liquidity also is another thing, right? It's a lot more liquid to go dollars to USDC or another stablecoin than it is to go BRL to another BRL stablecoin, BRL fiat to BRL stablecoin, and then a US dollar stablecoin at that. But those are probably the main names that come to mind.
Makes sense. And then on the, you're talking about the U.S. stablecoin off ramps. Like, how do you think about on the U.S. side or some of the global providers, just in, how do you choose your stablecoin infrastructure? How do you choose who you partner with? This is, a very emerging field, right? So, and there's a lot of regulatory scrutiny on it. There's, is it the organizations, are they sufficiently backed? Are they, and how is their structure? So there's kind of a lot behind the scenes and just the stablecoin issuance and infrastructure. So how have you thought about it as a company that's kind of built, on that backbone?
So one of our favorites right now is USDC. I think they're kind of at this interesting nexus of trust, reliability, credibility. They have that monthly audit report through a third party where this is released for public consumption on their website. There's USDT, which is more used more widely internationally across Latin Asia. That's like highest in circulation. That's interesting, but USDC kind of being our default. I think the future of stablecoins is going to change dramatically. We're seeing a lot of people, including Paxos, launching yield-bearing stablecoins. And this is what's interesting to me, is that like none of them are regulated in the US for a good reason. Given that the whole idea of a yield-bearing stablecoin is that they'll pass on the underlying T-bill rate to the holder, right, of the stablecoin. The reason that offered in the US is that it would be regulated as a security. But it's also conveniently a great way to make money off that if you're the minter. So, folks like Paxos offering out of Abu Dhabi, M0, which is another provider, Mountain Protocol. So we're definitely closely watching a lot of these that are popping up, because I think these will offer value for providing liquid yield or savings to the users.
One of the interesting things I've seen kind of behind the scenes in this space is there was so much regulatory scrutiny on stablecoins because, these are folks that are minting or issuing, in the early days in a very unregulated way, and how much was actually, how strong was the backing, if they were sitting on commercial paper or real estate or other things. One of the fascinating changes I've seen is, a lot of backroom discussion with the regulators on, hey, we are going to take a much more open or positive stance as long as you, move this over into T-bills, right? As long as it's, backed by government debt, we're good. If it's backed by, principally by other things, then we're less good. And I think on one hand that clearly makes, the risk level significantly lower. On the other hand, what it has done is good and bad. It's intrinsically tied stablecoin issuance to, sort of government debt, government bonds, and the regulators that are sort of related to it. And I think the fascinating thing now is, in a way, it's actually made it so that crypto can't go away because, now the largest stablecoin issuers are some of the largest holders of government-backed debt, right? And so, and it's a whole episode on what's going on with government debt, but at the end of the day, now it's a massive, massive supporter of the bond. So I think you're right that those are there to stay. And then the question is just which ones are the regulators going to be work with more frequently. So.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic because I think we also saw during the March events, right, concerns about assets that were in FDIC-insured banks, which was a bit ironic. I think a lot of folks were not anticipating that, but how that may have caused certain depegging of USDC, to be quite frank. And it's almost like a win-win instead of going towards government debt, as long as we obviously believe in the government debt being still of the highest rated. The intention idea there is that everyone wins from the high yield interest that's passed along, the trust in the underlying asset, U.S. Government bonds.
What do you think though happens to the business model of stablecoins? If we go into a ZERP world or at least a significantly lower interest rate world, how does that affect the issuers of stablecoins and, like you were saying, the folks that are downstream that are relying on yield? Like, what happens to the business model?
That is the question that I think a lot of us are definitely curious about. I think it's very easy to passively make money when you're sitting on billions of your token in circulation, but you have to start to find other ways to adopt and build other payment tools. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see some of the stablecoin minters trying to launch various products that that I would say like accommodate specific experiences, whether it's checkouts, bill payments, you name it, that they've like allowed the ecosystem to build around. But I think they will be pulled into for I'd say the need, right, of monetizing in other ways. I think that diversification is going to be incredibly important if we ever, when we eventually reach like a world again.
So Ezra, as you kind of look out across the world, where are you excited to go to next? Anywhere else where you're seeing kind of the same tailwinds that drew you to Brazil?
Brazil's really drawn us to more Asia flows. We're realizing that given a lot of the trade that happens with Brazil and China and Southeast Asia in general, we're finding ourselves doing a lot more discovery work out there. Because of this, the U.S. like Mexico nearshoring push has been so significant that we're seeing more and more players that are like very keen on understanding how do we leverage like stablecoins as a part of the workflow, right? Like it's one thing to solve the payment, but it's another thing to solve the workflow in tandem. And so I get excited about the U.S.-Mexico corridor, get excited about the Brazil-Asia corridor. And the more we get pulled into Asia for like a lot of the imports coming to Brazil, the more we also get pulled into Europe for a lot of export. And you can imagine that a lot of the, I'd say, opportunity we've seen in Brazil, like you'll see similar challenges or opportunities posed in places like South Africa and across the continent. So more near term would definitely be Asia, like I'd say expanding our Mexico-U.S. corridor, and more, just LATAM coverage. I think at one point you'd actually asked about Argentina as well, Jeremy, and a lot of our customers say, hey, we also do a lot of trade across the Americas, across South America. So we'd love to see more support of like Brazil-Bolivian trade corridor, Brazil-Argentina for that matter. Argentina being in the top 5 trade partners.
We're unlikely to see you back in DC anytime soon, though. It sounds like.
It sounds like I'll be back for the holidays to see my folks, but it seems like I would be spending considerable time in South America, Southern Hemisphere, for sure.
Yeah, the interesting thing you're kind of implying in that is, I think we've had guests on and we've talked kind of a fair bit about like the global South as an opportunity in Bitcoin, crypto, and sort of stable coins for cross-border transactions, really for like remittances in the diaspora. So that's sort of one use case. And that's very, the global South maybe to, a mature market. And then what you're describing as a slightly different side of it, which is on the B2B side, it's like, where are the trade alliances, and where are the trade corridors? So those are more like, LATAM to LATAM, or rebalancing of nearshoring US to Mexico, or to, an incredibly fast growing economy like Brazil, where the cross-border supply chain is really, the driving factor, right, for business like you, and where you see these kind of more commercialized opportunities, I assume.
We had to like kind of answer this question early on. Like we support certain like B2C businesses as well that want to solve for remittances, even like in some cases payroll and other use cases. But the bulk of our customers being more in the trade scenario, there's like I'd say shared challenges, but also a unique set, I would say, for each subgroup. And on the trade circumstance, there's always this question of how do you help us with treasury management? How do you help us with streamlining like our understanding of where our funds are at any one point, given that SWIFT will not only create delays, but also because of these delays, create all sorts of fees and issues with like any one company that's like managing its fund flows across South America, right? Say from Brazil to Colombia, or Brazil to Netherlands for that matter. And I think this is part of the exciting part of building a startup is you have your own thesis and hypothesis around how you're building, but you often learn a lot from your customers who start to guide you on that journey. On the request, start to see a lot of these similarities. That the common thread for us being the the move towards building a lot of that flow for cross Latam or intra Latam, and then Latam to export Europe and importing from Asia. So
so when you're talking about treasury, one of the things we've seen is depending on the size of the company, they get very sophisticated, right, about like currency hedging, when they need to, buy goods and services, and how do they manage that? And oftentimes you're right, that's a very manual process when they're looking at, where are their currency balances and where are they doing their FX rates. So like, does that get easier for businesses when, this stuff is a little bit more real time, and a little bit more digital? Like, do you see not just the payment infrastructure itself, but the ability for the businesses to, think and act, more intelligently about, if they have multiple subsidiaries across, different regions or whatever, that they can, manage treasury in kind of more of an intelligent way?
Very much so. Like, actually, I kind of was riffing off like a real example, and I'll use some fake maybe names to highlight this example. There's a company that approached us that was, works with a bank partner. One of the issues they ran into is they overdrafted pulling funds. It's a large conglomerate that originates in the EU, but has presence across the world, like particularly in South America. And so they had overdrafted pulling funds from their account in Brazil, sending funds to Colombia. And in that circumstance, that was an overdraft of the order of magnitude of like hundreds of millions of dollars. And yeah, like, not something I've seen in my personal bank account.
No.
Like, not something I promise in the near future.
Wait. So did they get like a $15 fee? Like how did that?
Fee to say the least, right? Also, not a fee that I probably would ever see in my bank account near future. But I remember seeing this and trying to stifle my reaction. It was alarming, to say the least. And they're like, "This is a very real issue that we run into all the time." And it's like, it wasn't a fat finger issue. It was an issue just simply because they didn't know how much was sitting in their bank account, right? Like, there's a figure that is shown to you when you look at your bank portal, but that doesn't always accurately represent like how much is actually going to move out the next day, because you scheduled a wire, right, the day prior, a few days prior. Yep. Simply because like a wire can sometimes be a day, which would be best case scenario, and sometimes it can be like 6 days, or sometimes there could be some issue with the corresponding bank network.
Again, though, like, I think it comes back to what you were saying before, which is like, it's not about building new amazing technology necessarily. It's about building a better experience for your customers and building a product that people really want to use that makes their lives easier.
Most of us like are not going to think about when we're at the grocery store, when I'm swiping my card or doing Apple Pay or whatever it might be, or paying Get Fix, that, oh wow, this is what's happening in the background, right? I just care that money's leaving my account to pay for the groceries that I can then go cook at home when I get there. And I think the end of the day, that's what most of these companies are thinking about. I want to make sure that I can go on to my business and not have to worry about this part, which those of us on this podcast and those who are watching this podcast probably love a whole lot more than our goods, right? For that matter. We for whatever reason, are very drawn to this problem set.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the overdraft protection on. Did they have it on? Did they have it off? Like, what happened? I have so many questions in my head now on what happens when you overdraft in the other country $100 million. But that just shows the magnitude of this problem.
I agree. And by the way, it's like not only an issue like fees with the bank, it's also an issue with like fines by the government for overdrafting for that reason. So yeah, it's a conundrum, to say the least.
Well, and reputation with the people that don't get paid, right? Like, there are a lot of follow-on effects.
Well, it's if you can fix that, that's a noble calling, right? So, Ezra, this has been awesome, man. I appreciate it. We've enjoyed the time. It's good to battle with you on a little bit on like, should CBDCs go in the dumpster? Maybe not. But this is super cool, and I think there's a really, really good use case for what you guys are building. Where can folks find you, man?
Reach me out on Twitter, LinkedIn. So Twitter, I'm at Ezra Radar. On LinkedIn, Ezra Kabrab. And otherwise, just give me a shout on either. If you ever come into, I'd say São Paulo to pay a visit, or Mexico City, for that matter. And we're Caliza.com. So always, awesome. If you hear from us, it's probably gonna be me. So I'm always trying to be the friendly face that greets folks that come to Caliza.
bring the man a new album and he'll throw open the doors for you.
I'll play your record if you make the trip.
Killer. Thanks so much, Ezra. Great chatting with you.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you, guys.
All right, awesome, guys. We appreciate it. Catch us on episodes on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and wherever podcasts are at the ReDefined Pod. And this was another great episode. Thanks, Ezra, and we'll catch you later.
Thank you.